Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and to help you engage with the Texas legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness. And don't worry, we'll talk more about the Texas legislature soon, but today we're taking a break for an important conversation with Reverend Deanna Hollas, coordinator of Gun Violence Prevention Ministries with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. We'll talk with Deanna about the increased emphasis national denominations are placing on reducing gun violence and how congregations can both act locally and advocate for policy change to reduce gun violence. Speaking of ending gun violence, guess what? Texas Impact has a team for that. This team is made up of Texans of faith interested in working and advocating for public policies that reduce gun violence. We're highlighting this important issue this week because that team is hosting a series of actions and displays calling attention to the impact gun violence has in local communities. This Saturday, November 18th in San Antonio, they're hosting a March for Gun Violence Prevention. This is an issue that has impacted every one of our communities, so I hope you'll consider joining to help end gun violence. Learn more about that event or Texas Impact's Gun Violence Prevention team at texasimpact.org. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Reverend Deanna Hollas. Joining us for today's conversation is Reverend Deanna Hollas, Gun Violence Prevention Ministry Coordinator with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Deanna, you have a really long title. I love it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start out by talking about Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Talk to us about your organization and what you all do.
So the Peace Fellowship has been around. They're celebrating 80 years this next year. And predominantly it was started as a conscientious objector organization and did that for a really long time of its life. Started, around the First and Second World War, and then all the way up through Vietnam. And then once we shifted to more of a volunteer military, they began to expand into other areas, but still predominantly, nonviolence is what the organization is about, and how we can call the church to be the church, to really, influence policy that happens at the national level, as well as, empowering and equipping congregations to be more peace focused, nonviolent focused, and justice focused.
Love it. We keep talking about our 50-year anniversary, but 80 years, y'all have got us beat. So love to hear that, and I'm grateful for y'all's work. How long has gun violence prevention been a part of that? Is that a relatively new phenomenon, or has gun violence prevention been at the heart for years?
Yeah, it's always been part of the organization, again, kind of peripherally, in that the Reverend Jim Atwood was a Presbyterian who has written many books and been very active in gun violence prevention efforts for many decades. And in fact was one of the major things that came out of, I think, the Peace Fellowship and Jim Atwood's work is the policy that the Presbyterian Church, this is PCUSA, has and adopted in 2010. Now, the denomination's been speaking out against gun violence for 50 years, but in 2010 came a really major policy called Gun Violence Gospel Values, in which it really outlined, the roles of calling on the church at all levels, from the national denomination all the way down to the congregational level, to be engaged, informed, and active in ending gun violence. And that was what the initial kind of how the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship said, how about we take that? Because what we were seeing is it wasn't really getting transmitted down to the congregational level. Let's take that policy and see how we can get congregations involved. And so they created a congregational toolkit, which you can get on our website. And then they hired me. And that's predominantly my role, is how can we equip and empower the individuals at the congregational level to be engaged and active in preventing gun violence.
We're going to come back to what congregations can do, but I know we have a lot of faith leaders who listen to this program, and I know a lot of people are interested in the why question, why our guests do the work that they do. So I want to give you a chance to talk about that some. You obviously feel called and passionate about this work. Why have you chosen this to be the way you spend your ministry life?
Yeah, I think it's more like it chose me. It was one of those things that I just kept finding myself, the right person at the right time. And it predominantly, I went to seminary, felt first called to spiritual direction, but then, kept going through the ordination process. And so graduated in 2015, but wasn't really sure, didn't really see myself in a congregational role at the time. And then in 2016, Texas passed a law that allowed guns on college campuses. And I'm a native Texan, grew up to a family of hunters and gun owners. So I really didn't think much about what was happening to our gun laws in the state. But then when they allowed guns on college campuses, our oldest daughter was a student at Texas Tech at the time, and I witnessed how her friends and her roommates were responding to the law. And they responded exactly as the law was intended, and that they saw it as an invitation to buy guns. And so not knowing, how I was going to be able to keep my daughter safe if everybody in her world was suddenly going to be armed, and I had no idea, what type of training they were having. Just feeling helpless. I had a friend who had recently joined Moms Demand Action. So I joined Moms Demand Action, and I served as the Dallas chapter faith lead for 2 years. And while in that role, the NRA came to Dallas for their annual convention. And I had been connected with an organization, an interfaith organization here called Faith for Dallas, that was, formed after the police shooting in downtown Dallas. And they decided that we were going to have a prayer vigil. We were going to hold a prayer vigil on the steps of City Hall from the beginning of the convention until the end. And it was during that time that I realized there might be a role that needs to be served here, that I saw. Faith leaders have so many issues that they are, having to deal with and advocate and try to, see change in. And I was doing the deep dive through Moms Demand Action. So I thought, if maybe this is a role to be ordained to this would give me a voice, a greater voice, both in the church as well as in the public sphere. And to be able to really support faith leaders who didn't have the capacity to really do that deep dive.
Yeah. Love that. I also was struck when you were talking about the NRA convention in Dallas. I'm a United Methodist, and our annual conference in Houston a couple of years ago was in the hotel connected with the George R. Brown in Houston, and overlapped with the NRA convention there just a couple of weeks after the Uvalde shooting. Oh, wow. And so there were definitely a lot of clergy and faith leaders in that annual conference who had things to say. And we're seeing that throughout the country, right? Faith leaders are increasingly speaking out on this issue. And I know you're not a representative of a denominational body per se, but if we look at the denominations, as we look at the judicatories, there are a lot of issues they can address, like you just mentioned, but this is one that they're increasingly speaking out on. Can you talk to us some about that resurgence? Why is it happening, and what does that look like?
Yeah, first of all, and I just want to be clear that too, like I'm a white person and serve in a predominantly white congregation, and so this is a resurgence of this is white congregations, mainline congregations that are kind of speaking up and stepping out, because I know that my friends that are in predominantly Black congregations, they've been speaking out for a long time, but just weren't getting heard because the gun violence impacts them very differently than it often does the white congregations. And so sadly, what really has been getting white congregations involved has been school shootings. There's so many organizations that were formed in the wake of Sandy Hook. And it became a time when people just couldn't, ignore. And it's continued. There's been, I think, the three main movements that I've seen in my time in this work is then whenever the Parkland school shooting happened, and those students became such powerful advocates to be able to say, there's enough. And then even with, Texas Impact, whenever the Uvalde shooting happened, that there's something about school shootings that everybody tends to say, this is not okay, that this is something that we are not willing to tolerate anymore. And so, but as a whole, I think the church is also in the position of, we're the ones that hold the funerals. We're the ones that hold the vigils. And there's something about when you continue to pray for a problem, that makes you be able to say, why is this happening? And what is it that we can be able to do about it? And when I talk to congregations, one of the things that I want them to know and to understand is that why this is happening is because of the gun industry and the fact that the gun is a non-consumable product that needs to be sold in a saturated market. So every law that we have or don't have that gets dismantled, it's all about gun sales. And so that's what people need to know and understand, because oftentimes I think as churches, we can tend to focus on that this is personal or individual. Is it a matter of the heart? How do we get to help people change individually? And while there's value in that, what it's really about is this greater role culture that our lawmakers have allowed to be created based upon putting gun industry profits ahead of public safety. And so when we can see that larger picture, it really shifts the conversation to be able to say, how does this sell guns or not sell guns? And one of the things that we know is the more gun violence we have, the more guns that are sold. And so that's one of the biggest increases in gun manufacturing, which then translates into gun sales, was Sandy Hook. That was for the first time, we just skyrocketed. And so that's why we didn't see any major legislation passed, because really at that time, even as much as a quarter Democrats were still getting A ratings from the NRA. So gun industry profits used to be a nonpartisan issue. And so that's what I think, we need to see, is that gun violence prevention is also a nonpartisan issue. And we as the church, can say, we are for the side of life. We are for creating systems and policies that are going to give people life that they can live into, the right to live in a safe world.
Yeah, so let's talk about what local congregations can do. This is another one of those issues where it seems like there are steps that local congregations can take both locally and through advocacy efforts. And so talk to us first about what you hope and wish congregations would do in their local communities to help curb gun violence.
Yeah, so there's, like you said, there's two avenues to really look at, and one is legislative and the other is cultural. So legislatively, we want folks to be able to get to know your lawmakers and to vote for, and to make sure that they know that the primary issue that you have is going to be gun violence prevention and gun safety laws. And so there's through Moms Demand Action, there is Gun Sense Voter. And so you can go to that website. It's gunsensevoter.org, and you can find out whether or not your representatives and who's running in your office and already elected, are they gun law friendly? And then to get to know them and hold them accountable, because this is how we're going to create change, is we're going to have to put people in office that are willing to change laws. That's going to be the most important thing that they can do on the legislation side. And then for cultural change, we know that we have more guns than we have people. And so the biggest thing that can happen is by demanding that the people who own guns actually store them safely and securely. And so every single person in the pew can talk to everybody that they know, and they can say, is there a gun in this home? And how is it stored? And so we have on our website at presbypeacefellowship.org, we actually have gun safety cards that you can take with you to have these conversations, to be able to, say, hey, we want guns to be safely and securely stored. I know, like I said, I grew up to a family of gun owners. I thought my dad was a responsible gun owner, but I was like, he just keeps his guns stored in the closet. And so I asked him one day, I said, Dad, do you know if any of your grandkids are suicidal? And he couldn't answer that in the affirmative, right? He realized, he was like, no. And I said, well, your guns are just in there. Anybody who comes into your home has access to them. And also, when you travel, if somebody were to ever break into your home, you've now easily armed anybody who would want to take these guns and do harm with them. So he now keeps his locked in a safe. And so we can have that impact if we can make sure that guns are securely locked and stored so that nobody but the gun owner has access to them. That can create a tremendous amount of change. And then the next thing we encourage congregations to do is use your parking lot to be a safe surrender site. Get a chop saw and chop up these unwanted guns, because oftentimes folks inherit guns. When I go and talk to people and they'll be like, I think we might have one in the basement. I mean, that's just not a way to have a gun, right? To where you're not checking it. You don't know if it's still safely stored or secured. And so we can be places to help dismantle these guns. Oftentimes what happens too is when a gun is used in suicide, those guns get returned to the family. And so churches are the place to be able to hold the trauma that can be associated with these guns, all this heavy emotions. And so we hold action circles, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Our next one starts on January 11th. It's 5 weeks that we will help guide you through and share the best practices that other congregations are doing so that you can be a place to where your community can disable these unwanted guns and be part of this safe storage.
Have you seen any congregations that have done this particularly well?
Yeah, there's several. One that I'm thinking of that's in Denver. This is kind of the Colorado areas where it's really being done well. And this is because Mike Martin, with Raw Tools, this is the area in which he lives. And so they have a Guns to Gardens Metro Denver area that is doing it. And they hold them maybe once a quarter, maybe even more frequently than that. And they're moving them around to different congregations. This was all based upon the model of a UCC, community UCC in Boulder, where in 2001, after there was that mass shooting at the King Super that was blocks from their congregation, they were left with, what can we do? They knew the people who were killed in that shooting. It was just devastating to their community. And they were told there's nothing you can do. The laws are never going to change. There's nothing you can do. And that was when they found Mike Martin and Raw Tools and said, let's hold a gun buyback and see, dismantle these weapons, and then they turn them into other useful things like garden tools and jewelry. And so that's what we model. What we teach is off of what happened in community at Community UCC.
Love that. And for those, we're on Zoom right now, and she just held up a shovel to show us one of the tools. You mentioned policy change. Is there anything in particular that folks should be advocating for right now?
Yeah, well, in Texas, I know we tried to do this at the last legislative session, but raise the age to 21. I mean, it's just that simple, and it shouldn't be that hard. After the Uvalde shooting, my dad, he went to his local, actually, feed store, which is where guns are sold, and went up and asked. He was like, "Hey, if I want to buy an AR-15, how long will it take?" And the guy said, "Well, I'm going to run a background check, but you'll pass it. So it'll probably take about 15 minutes. And then he said, "How many can I buy?" And the guy said, "As many as you can afford." And my dad was just floored, right? Like, this longtime gun owner is like, really? We allow an 18-year-old to be able to walk into a store and buy as many of these as they want. And so, that right there, being able to raise the age to 21, I think that's what's going to be most impactful in Texas. But on a national level, we're calling to reinstate the assault weapons ban. There really is no reason for these guns to be in civilian use. It was an effective ban. It worked when it was in place from 1994 to 2004. But the gun industry needs to sell guns. And so when you have a non-consumable product and you have a saturated market, there's things you have to do. You have to either get new customers to buy your same guns, or you have to get your regular customers to buy new guns. And the way to do that is to change the product. And that is how come we are seeing these guns become more deadly, more powerful, is because this is now the new bread and butter of the gun industry. They've shifted their marketing away from hunting and sportsmen and towards the warrior gun owner, and so this is a lot of pushback. But this is what we need to do in order to create the world that is safe for our children. This is just not something that we need to have. And there's a great resource. I encourage people to learn all they can about the gun industry. And I'll give you 3 great resources. And the first is read the book Beating Guns by Mike Martin and Shane Claiborne. They have a little bit of history of the gun industry in that book, as well as it's just a good book to give you some why Christians in particular should be concerned about gun violence. The next is there's 2 really good resources that just came out, and one is a website called smokinggun.org. And there you can go and you can read about Smith & Wesson and when they tried to actually have smart, safe, responsible practices as a manufacturer. Like, we could have smart technology on guns where only the gun owner is the one responsible. But when your product is one that people use to kill, it's really hard to sell it, if folks know they're going to be held accountable or responsible for how they might use it. So it's also really sells a lot of guns when you get your gun stolen, because that means you've got to buy a new one, or you just create a situation of more fear. So it's important to be able to learn as much as you can about the gun industry, and that's a great website. And then there's also a podcast that just came out called the Gun Machine, and it really brings in the racial issues that are around gun violence as well, and that we have to understand that, predominantly for a good portion of our time as a country, only white men were allowed to own guns. And so the gun industry has been exploiting white supremacy and our racial tensions and for a long time. And now the new customers, that they're really going for are women and people of color, because, now everybody can have guns. So I think it's important that we become aware of what's happening and where we're going, so we can carry on conversations that are going to actually lead to change.
All right. Deanna, I really appreciate the time. You beat me in part to my shameless plugs question. I love the resources there, but any other closing thoughts or shameless plugs you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, just do something. I think oftentimes when people begin to, they turn away from learning about gun violence because they're just like, it's so overwhelming. And so it can lead to a shutdown. That happened with me when I first got involved and I started learning. But gun laws work. There's also 2 really great articles that just came out that show, the proof that where states that have stronger gun laws, they have less gun violence. The states that have weaker gun laws, there's more gun violence. Texas we used to have some of the strongest gun laws in the country. And that was because we had the most gun owners. And we used to understand that that gun ownership and responsibility went hand in hand. But again, as this non-consumable product needs to be sold, and this realization that the more gun violence there is, the more guns that are sold, Texas laws have been dismantled over the last several years. I mean, one thing people could do right now that I forgot to mention is, the ATF is taking comments right now, public comments, and it's only till December 9th is the deadline. So it's when you go to my document, there's a link to every town that they can go to and do that by December 9th. Go to our website, presbypeacefellowship.org, download the toolkit, join with Texas Impact and all the work that y'all do locally, and sign up for Moms Demand Action. Text READY to 64433 and let people guide you through this process. When you have other folks that are doing it, you realize 80% of us want gun safety laws. There's no reason why we can't have it. Our lawmakers are just beholding to this 20%. And once they realize that we're going to start voting for different lawmakers and that this is the one issue that we're going to vote on, because gun violence is the number 1 killer of all children and youth. And this is unacceptable.
Reverend Deanna Hollas, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate both the time today and the work that you continue to do on behalf of a more safe community. So thanks again for everything.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Reverend Deanna Hollas. Y'all, these are not fun conversations, but the impact of gun violence is far too prevalent. We all know someone who's been affected, and so I hope we'll all take this work seriously. I appreciate Reverend Hollas taking the time, and I appreciate you tuning in. As we close out this episode today, I would remind you that the Texas legislature is meeting while we're recording, and there are many ways that you can get plugged in. We'll talk more about it in future episodes, but make sure to keep an eye on texasimpact.org to find out how you can get involved. While you're there, I hope you'll consider joining Texas Impact to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. You can also reach out to me directly at scott@texasimpact.org for more. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.